Hello, I'm Dr. Clare Craig. I'm a diagnostic pathologist and co-chair of the HART group. And I wanted to tell you the story of what happened in the last few years to all of us and to me. I cared greatly about my career. I had ambitions for high status and I worked hard for my pension and for my future security. My life is totally different now. For 3 years I worked harder than I had ever worked but wasn't being paid. What I'm going to tell you may surprise you, but it's only when compared to the official story. Everything I say is backed up with solid evidence. To start, let me take you back to 2020. There was an environment of unprecedented fear, expertly manufactured by government, with behavioural scientists who said the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. I've always been a worrier. I had a baseline anxiety which would flare up on occasion and become fairly debilitating. I was afraid in spring 2020. At first for myself, but when we learnt more about things, for my older friends and for the NHS. By summertime, I knew something was not right. I'm a specialist diagnostic doctor, and it was the testing that concerned me. We were over-diagnosing test errors as COVID. Once the children were back at school in September, I dug into the data to see if I could prove my concerns were justified, and I did. I sought advice on what to do about it, and I was told, just get it out there. I'd never done social media before, and I reluctantly set up a blog and Twitter account and showed where the problem lay. I naively expected one of two outcomes. Either my concerns were wrong, and people would explain how they had accounted for them, or else they might say they hadn't noticed and would look into it. I was so naive. What actually happened was that I came under attack. At the same time, a whole series of wonderful people introduced themselves to me and offered their support. Many of them had been through the same experience, and I ended up watching as other naive experts innocently voiced concerns and were treated to the same abuse. Some of these experts were calling out the harms to children. Abused children were locked at home with their abusers. Moreover, these abusers themselves were subject to unprecedented stresses, whether around money or not having their usual outlets to keep themselves level-headed. Children were deprived of their social needs, and important milestones were not marked. Child mental health services were overwhelmed. Language development ended up months behind because of masking. Others called out the harm to the lonely and the most vulnerable, locked away from loved ones. Remember, even after the harm had been done, measured, written about, there was still a second and third lockdown afterward. There were more deaths in 2020 than in any year since 2008, but fewer than any year before then. This graph shows deaths per capita for various bad flu years. 2020 and 2021 were of a similar magnitude, although the timing in 2020 was a bit unusual. It's naive to think this was all due to a virus. There were many other things that would have increased mortality rates. 10 to 20% of hospital staff, including emergency staff, were told to isolate if they had a cough or a fever. Patients who needed life-saving treatment were told to stay at home. Patients were scared to attend in case they caught COVID. Blanket do-not resuscitation orders were applied to large groups of people, including the old and those with learning disabilities. Hospitals refused to admit anyone that had a do-not resuscitate order. ICU raised the bar for admission. It became harder to get a place. Care home staff had to deal with absences and were unable to provide the hydration they usually can provide because they had to put on PPE every time, thinking that that was life-saving. GPs no longer attended nursing homes. Antibiotics and attention were no longer given to those who had a pneumonia in the community. And there was plenty of fear, which we know hampers immune responses. Protocols for COVID were distributed with a binary choice between ventilate or the use of drugs that reduced the respiratory drive. All of these come with an increased mortality rate. Lockdowns and masks did not work, and they could not work. Waves peak naturally without intervention. The claim that spread was through large droplets that would fall to the ground was a lie based on a mistake. Infected people emit aerosols that shrink with evaporation and hang in the air indefinitely and disperse widely. It was like walking around with a cloud of aerosols around us, like Pigpen from Charlie Brown. Everyone was exposed to every variant, and our immune systems prevented infection in the majority for each wave. We were presenting facts and standing up for basic ethical principles. First, do no harm. The precautionary principle, which is to not expose the healthy to unnecessary risk, including unexpected and unknown risks. Adults have a duty to protect children. Informed consent, bodily autonomy, and yet we were attacked using all sorts of slurs. In January 2021, a minister from the Justice Department carried out a public shaming. It was really hard to respond to. For much of it, he was pointing at things that I had said that were true, and I gave sources to back everything up. But because they were things people didn't believe, that was enough for it to be a smear. How do you respond when people are laughing at you for calling the sky blue? Rather than let them attack us as outliers, a group of us came together to form a voluntary body of professionals, HART, including scientists, doctors, statisticians, ethicists, psychotherapists, and other experts. We challenged and corrected each other and together wrote essay after essay showing how the claims made about COVID contradicted the body of knowledge amassed over decades of science. We were not contrarians on principle, but where policy was clearly doing more harm than good, we called it out in an evidence-based way. We don't always agree with each other, but over 3 years have created a comprehensive and cohesive body of work. Soon after forming, we witnessed a change in approach to COVID vaccines, from cautious optimism to pathological optimism. The word vaccine is incredibly powerful. We're taught that they are a modern medical miracle. It's a term that should never have been given to these products, which are not like traditional vaccines in numerous ways. I'm no anti-vaxxer. I've had more than most as a doctor, and my children more than most as we lived in the USA for a while. They were sold to us on the basis of more than could ever be realistically achieved, that they would create an impenetrable herd immunity that would rid the world of COVID and allow a return to normal life. And we found that the saviour NHS was replaced with a new saviour. The saviour vaccine. It was going to rid us of COVID and create a new beginning, leading us out of darkness of lockdowns and restrictions. Its arrival was celebrated with joy and even songs of worship. People adorned their bodies in celebration. Churches and cathedrals were turned over to ensuring everyone could be saved. Many people described how they shed tears of joy and relief when being injected, praising and thanking science along the way. Church leaders endorsed it, with the Archbishop of Canterbury saying Jesus would get one, and the Pope calling it an act of love. In the UK, people were bribed with pizza, free takeaway and taxi rides. They moved to lotteries for students. Elsewhere, there were prizes of apartments and motorbikes. In the US, they offered guns. The Aussies offered beer. When Switzerland and Austria started offering sex, the escalation stopped. Had it become too obvious, they were buying access to people's bodies. Although many HART members were vaccinated very early on, we watched the evidence of their real-world effect closely and saw that they had been massively oversold. But anyone questioning or criticising these novel treatments were shut down as blasphemers, shut down and punished. The blasphemers were threatened not only with loss of career, but with prison sentences. The non-believers were also threatened with prison, fines, and even denial of health care. The WHO started using the phrase, "No one is safe unless everyone is safe," from August 2020. This credo was used to make claims that the young should be injected to protect granny and to justify unethical vaccine passports and mandates. Within a few months of the rollout, there were numerous examples of outbreaks among heavily vaccinated populations. By July 2021, there was an outbreak on HMS Queen Elizabeth, where 100% were vaccinated. There was an outbreak in an Israeli hospital where 96% were vaccinated, and then in a series of heavily vaccinated US university campuses. They did not work to prevent infection. The chances you've had it barely change whether you were vaccinated or not. But were they safe? It's simply not possible to have a clinical trial that could show safety from a statistical perspective. In a hypothetical situation, if there was a drug that killed 1 in 4,000 people, that would not show up as statistically significant in a trial of 44,000 people over 6 months. But it would be an enormous risk. I'm not suggesting this was the risk, but it illustrates the problem with proving safety. Surveillance systems were key to measuring any safety issues, and this is where doctors report on their concerns. These alarm systems blared loudly. The red bar here shows reports of deaths in the USA after vaccines, and in blue are the death reports for all other vaccines. There was a big problem here and in every other measure, and they were all totally ignored. This shows the English data for life-threatening ambulance calls. It was steady at 2,000 calls per day, with a dip during lockdown, but then it rocketed during the vaccine rollout with an extra 500 per day and has not returned to baseline. In the meantime, there have been excess non-COVID deaths seen across the Western world over the same time frame. Who's been dying? Well, let's start with who it's not. The top graph here shows unexpected extra deaths in bars above zero, and where there are fewer than expected deaths, the bars are below zero. After 2 periods of high deaths, we would expect to see missing deaths because some people have already died. After 2 years of few deaths in this group, we can expect high levels of deaths in coming winters. What we saw for dementia is what we would have expected to see for all the other causes. Now look at ischemic heart disease, and the picture is very different. Yes, there were deaths with the early COVID waves and lockdowns. But since vaccination, these deaths have been incessant, and they're not COVID deaths, which are marked in yellow on the bottom graph. This is also true for heart failure deaths. Deaths have been at a similar level to those seen in the first COVID winter, but have not been due to COVID since the vaccine rollout. The 50 to 64-year-old age group has been worse affected. Tragically, it has also affected the youngest age groups, children who are at no statistical risk from COVID. Could these extra deaths be due to the long-term effects of COVID? Well, that's an important question. No, and we know this because of Australia. South Australia had only 1,000 cases across the whole state before December 2021, when Omicron arrived. During the rollout in the 15 to 44-year-olds, the cardiac presentations to the emergency department rose from 1,300 to 2,172 in a month. It peaked in November 2021, before COVID arrived. And Australia has had the same excess deaths problem as us, starting at the same time. The deaths and emergencies are only the tip of an iceberg of harm. How much harm? Well, one way to measure is to see how many people can't work because of long-term sickness. For women, the numbers plateaued when COVID arrived, and they were falling before vaccines arrived. After the vaccine, they rocketed to astronomically high levels, 1 in more than 1 billion chance of that happening by chance alone. For men, the pattern was similar. There was no long COVID impact prior to vaccinations, but it takes off on rollout. The same happened in America, with a significant rise from early 2021. These were real people who were treated worse than blasphemers. They were apostates to this cult. They were attacked as anti-vaxxers despite having taken the vaccines. They have struggled to be believed by the healthcare system and even by their own friends and family, and consequently set up support groups. Do you remember the glee with which it was reported that Facebook had shut down these groups, having learnt that these support groups were using a carrot emoji so they would not be taken down? Groups were unable to share unproven vaccine harm posts in plain sight, they said. These people desperately needed that support, and it was taken out from under them. People have repeatedly dismissed these concerns as having been worth it for the greater good. Well, was it? Here is the global trajectory of accumulating COVID deaths. You can see that it stays pretty constant before flattening off in 2022 with the arrival of Omicron. Omicron is half as deadly. If the vaccines had worked to even halve deaths, we should have seen that flattening off before, but we did not. The claim of 20 million lives being saved is just a fantasy based purely on modelled data. The UK, Portugal and Ireland are all outliers for the Delta wave. But if we look at the USA and at Europe as a whole, the deaths for the Wuhan, Alpha and Delta waves are of the same order of magnitude and only fell away with the arrival of Omicron. There were indeed fewer deaths per case for Delta, but we don't know that that doesn't happen with repeated influenza waves, for example. All we know is that with influenza, each death wave was similar to the last, just like this. The nail in the coffin comes from looking at heavily vaccinated countries that had no COVID until Omicron arrived. From early 2022 up until summertime, New Zealand had 400 deaths per million. Australia and South Korea, it was the same if you subtract the 100 that they had to begin with. Let's compare that figure to the deaths seen elsewhere in spring 2020 with the Wuhan variant. France and Europe as a whole had fewer than 400 deaths per million. The UK had twice as many, but remember, Omicron is half as deadly. So where is the benefit of the vaccine? As if that wasn't bad enough, there is good evidence from multiple sources that the vaccinated have been infected by Omicron at higher rates than the unvaccinated. The more doses, the higher the risk. There's plenty more I could tell you. It gets worse, especially the power plays behind it all. But I want to give you my testimony. Among the various groupings I found myself in were plenty of Christians who had known something was wrong from the moment the church doors were slammed shut. 3 things happened to me. First, Christians kept coming up to me, asking if I was a Christian, and then telling me they thought I was protected. It was not that thing to say to someone who's coming under attack. And then they'd said that they would pray for me. The strange thing was that from around that time, I did start to feel protected. Instead of attacks creating anxiety, I had an inner peace I hadn't experienced since being a child. Secondly, I learnt to view the truth in a different way. We had learnt the hard way, how people care more about credentials than evidence, how goalposts shift when something becomes indisputable, how it's easy to make someone curious and hope they take it further than just to tell them the whole truth, how the same conclusions can come from different areas of expertise and different voices. At first, I identified the truth using only supporting evidence, but I soon began to discern patterns in how what are perceived as inconvenient truths are treated compared to their counterparts, both intentional and unintentional falsehoods. I observed this for mistakes I made too. When someone is thought to be wrong, their mistake is magnified and shared widely to discredit them. In contrast, when someone voices an inconvenient truth, it gets shut down. When someone is wrong, people laugh at the content of the error. With an inconvenient truth, it's the messenger who gets ridiculed. When someone is wrong, there's always an enthusiastic engagement to correct them. The one correcting the error gets kudos for their discernment. But when an inconvenient truth is revealed, the messenger, not the message, becomes the target of attack. When someone is wrong, the boundaries of their claim are easy to discern, but the truth, it's elusive. Together we might inch closer to understanding it, but it remains frustratingly just beyond our full grasp. When someone is already wrong, there's no need to further muddy the waters. Their idea stands erroneous on its own. But when someone unveils an inconvenient truth, efforts are made to twist it or to weave falsehoods around it. So when people discard the lie, they're lulled into thinking they've also dismissed the embedded truth. Thirdly, I started to find evil in all its forms. I saw how terrible evils could be perpetrated by people who believed they were doing good, but I also saw how few people spoke out to alert them to their mistakes. I saw people worshipping career, money, and prestige, which meant that their ethical principles were not defended. When one person does that, you might think it wouldn't matter too much, but this was happening at scale, and the consequences of it were catastrophic. The evils perpetrated by those in power during the COVID era were even worse. There is corruption at every level. Pharmaceutical companies committed fraud, regulators cheered them on, and even enabled the injection of children and the young who didn't even have a hypothetical hope of any benefit. The medical and other professional regulators have persecuted those who spoke out. Politicians have channeled money to their friends, and this happened in every single country across the world. Once my eyes have been opened to that, other evils revealed themselves. The passing of euthanasia legislation in Canada led to 30,000 medically assisted deaths in 2021, 1 in 30 of the deaths that year. I also had my eyes open to Satanists and other types of Gnostics who were indeed getting their earthly rewards. I saw the dark long before I saw the light. I reached the point where I realised that humans are so flawed that our efforts to do what we think is right could be doomed to failure. I started to realise how badly our society needed Christianity, and to see how Christianity was the perfect antidote to so many of the problems of our current society. What will motivate people to defend ethical principles when it will cost them to do so? But I didn't think I needed God in my life. I could see how easily I could have taken a wrong turn, how it could easily have been me responsible for harm. My friends started to convert to Christianity. One reminded me what it had been like trying to tell the truth, how people refused to read or found excuses to dismiss us as liars. With that in mind, she challenged me to read the gospel with an open mind. Did it sound like the truth or a lie? Were the people persecuted and even killed because it was true, or just because they were terribly taken in by a great big lie. It sounded true. There were even parallels in the censorship with John and Peter in Acts. Everyone living in Jerusalem knows they have performed a notable sign, and we cannot deny it. But to stop this thing from spreading any further among the people, we must warn them to speak no longer to anyone in this name. I started to pray. I spent 2 years surrounded by the most brilliant, intelligent, kind, ethical people, trying to find a way to reach a political solution to the problems that had been created. We were all realising that there wasn't going to be one, at least not on a workable time frame. Humans have made a mess of things, and I don't think humans can put this right alone. We have a saviour in Jesus, we need God's help, and more people are coming to him, including me. People have been horribly deceived. The threat from the virus was exaggerated, which allowed for the introduction of a saviour vaccine, one capable of ridding us of COVID altogether while being totally safe. Harms were ignored and concerns were silenced. Lives were destroyed, along with trust in public health, our ethical foundations, and the truth. I firmly believe we only come closer to the truth by listening to all voices. So thank you for listening to mine today.